co-sponsored by the League of Women Voters Austin area and Common Ground for Texans. This is part 2 of what's on your May ballot, where we're going to be delving into propositions for the Austin election and the Austin May ballot. Last week, Common Ground for Texans ran part 1, where the focus was on props D, E, F, and H, and that is the strong mayor, ranked choice voting, public campaign financing, and the election of the mayor in presidential years. There is a recording available for that, so we do encourage you to check that out if you weren't able to join them last week. My name is Jessica Foreman, and I am the Director of Advocacy at the League of Women Voters Austin area. And there are a few folks on this call who helped make this event happen, and I want to make sure and introduce them as well. Leah Mazziello is the Vice President of Programs at the Austin League, and she is integral in all of our events. Joanne Richards from Common Ground for Texans brought this idea to us. She is always full of good ideas, so we know to say yes when she brings one to us as well. And finally, Katie Sharin is our magnificent tech manager running everything in the background. So thank you, Leah, Joanne, and Katie for helping us get here today. Also, a big thank you to all the speakers who have taken time out of their Saturdays to join us. We're going to get to know all of them soon. But most of all, we want to thank you, the voters who are joining us today. So let's give a little roadmap of what this is going to look like. We're going to be starting on Prop A, which is about negotiations on the firefighters' contracts. Then we're going to be moving on to Prop B, the camping ban. Probably after a little bit 3 p.m., we're going to go into the discussion on Prop C, the Office of Police Oversight. And finally, we're going to end with Prop G, adding a new council district. Where possible, we have brought in speakers to represent both sides of the issue. If we couldn't find a speaker for both sides, I will be subbing in for the opposite side in order to make sure we're able to cover both the pro and con position for each proposition. When that happens, I will be taking off my moderator hat and putting on my position hat. I will not be reflecting anything the League of Women Voters Austin area or even my personal opinions on each of the propositions. We're just generally going to be talking about the opposite position so we can all think broadly about both sides. We also want you to participate. If you have a question, you can send it to Katie in the chat, or you can send it to me, either one, and then we may have time to take a few questions after each prop. We definitely won't have time to get through all the questions, but hopefully there'll be some we can answer as well. All elections are important, but this election, I'm sure you've noticed, has garnered a little more attention typically than May elections do. We aren't just dealing with hotel occupancy tax. No offense to that topic, but these topics have garnered a lot more attention. So we want to thank you for joining us today with an open mind to hear both sides of the issue. So let's get started with Prop A. I've got the content of the proposition up on the PowerPoint so that you can be looking at that while we have our first speaker. Our first panelist here today is Bob Nix, President of the Austin Firefighters Association. Bob is for Prop A. So Bob, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
So we're going to cover 3 things with you, Bob. First, we want you to explain to us what the current process is with contract negotiations for firefighters and how this would change it. Second, we want to know how this got on the ballot and what stakeholders or coalitions came together to do that. And finally, third, why should folks support Prop A? So to get us started, can you explain how the current contract negotiations work and how this proposition would change them?
Sure. The current negotiations are governed under state law, and we can basically bargain around the state law or civil service law to reach an agreement that's more favorable to both management and labor. And when we reach an impasse, which we have the last 3 of 6 times at bargaining, there are dispute resolution procedures available. In fact, they're the exact same dispute resolution. Binding arbitration is available where these positions can be sorted out by a neutral third-party arbitrator, but both sides have to agree. The biggest difference with what we're asking is that either side can compel the other side to come to binding arbitration and solve that issue more quickly.
Okay, great. And binding arbitration, I had to look that up myself, and we put some language there under Prop A. It's basically a tool where a third party, a neutral third party, not just any third party, but somebody who is certified, right, Bob, through the National Arbitrators Association, I think.
Yes, usually we use AAA, which is a National Arbitrators Association. It's agreed to by both management and labor. And what the city charter would do, AAA would give us a list of 9 arbitrators. And then management labor starts striking what they consider the more biased arbitrator. So they get down to that neutral arbitrator. And the value is that neutral arbitrator is not concerned with politics. He's only concerned with evidence and the community standard, the current community standards. So both sides produce their best evidence to make whatever case they want to on the issues. And then the arbitrator tries to reach consensus. And in the end, if they cannot, they make the call.
Okay, great. And this got on the ballot through a ballot initiative, right, through the Austin Firefighters Association. Can you talk to us about that process and what groups or coalitions are supporting this?
Sure, it's very stressful because we really expected to do it more in the fall, but because, as you probably know, you can only do a city charter amendment every 2 years. So we had to really kind of, hustle and get it done. So because of COVID, the firefighters started the initiative to get the 20,000 plus signatures. And because of COVID, we did it during really at the polling sites, and that's how we got it on the ballot.
So, since you're advocating for Prop A, can you explain why you think folks should vote for this and it would be a good thing for Austin?
Sure. If approved, this charter amendment would put in place impartial dispute resolution procedures that equally apply to both the City of Austin management and the firefighters. Passing this amendment can save the citizens money, solve labor disputes quickly, and allow firefighters to concentrate on their job of emergency response without distraction. Like I said earlier, the last 6 bargaining cycles have been to impasse 3 times. That's cost the citizens tens of millions of dollars in legal expenses and personnel shortages that really we feel could be solved quicker and go to more tangible citizen services. These dispute resolution procedures are binding arbitration, exist in law today. However, only one side can stop it from being implemented. And what this would do would allow each side equally to bring it forward and basically compel the arbitrator to come in and make that decision.
So there hasn't been a lot of public opposition to this proposition. The Austin Monitor did reach out to the City of Austin and the city manager and ask them their opinion on it, but they have not released a statement of opposition. But generally in these types of arguments, city management prefers to not have binding arbitration. So why is that? Why would those folks say this might be a con? So a person who was against Prop A might say that the city needs maximum flexibility. Employment contract negotiations affect city budgets for years down the line, and the city basically wants to maintain that bargaining chip. Additionally, there are other associations like the police and the EMS who may have different contracting processes, and how can this affect those contract negotiations? There's not a lot of cons that have been publicly stated on this. Those are just a few. Bob, do you want to respond to any of those?
Yes, and of course, my opinion will be sided towards my beliefs and what we're trying to accomplish, but I feel that more regressive type managers fear it. But there's examples like in Corpus where years ago, the city manager brought binding arbitration to the table and put it in the contract as a management initiative because they felt like it was a more fair way to reach dispute resolutions quickly and then bring harmony back to labor management relationships. So I do think that it tends to management looks at it as a ceding of their rights, but the evidence, when you look at how binding arbitration effect it's had in the private and public sector doesn't bear that out. The arbitrators always stay within the community standard. They look at the evidence both sides present. It's their decision to avoid a politics or leverage, and then they make the call. And I think a great example is south of us in San Antonio. San Antonio fire and management had a very contentious, and by the way, we don't have a contentious relationship right now with our management, but they had a tremendously contentious problem, between labor and management. And It went on for 7 years. The firefighters put binding arbitration on the ballot. I think the city didn't like it. And I was able to watch the 10-day arbitration. And after that was over, both sides came out and declared victory. The arbitrator looked at all the evidence, made a call, and both sides declared victory. And I believe that will happen here. The other thing I'd like to point out is when you have binding arbitration, both sides tend to be better actors at the table and get the issues worked out. And national evidence shows that too. Is when it's called the reverse narcotic effect. When you have binding arbitration, both sides tend to try to find a deal at the table, which is a fair way to reach the solution.
Great. We do have a few questions that we definitely have time for. What does community standards mean when the arbitrator is trying to make decisions?
They look at what the goals of the city has. The city may have goals for parks or things like that. They look at standards such as what the benefits and wages have been in the past. What you don't see with binding arbitration, gigantic swings, plus or minus, and that's why I think the community standard is important when the arbitrator tries to consider an award. So they look at the evidence, they look at what's already exists in terms of existing language and what the city is trying to accomplish in other areas, and they make a decision based on those primary factors.
One other question, in the process where the firefighters and the city are choosing the arbitrators and they make a strike, someone's asking what happens if everyone on the list gets striked? I'm assuming each group only gets a certain number, possibly.
There's an odd number, so the number is 9, and so I think actually civil service law said 7. We put in 9 to make it even more or less bias is a better way to put it. And so because there's an odd number, you get down to that neutral arbitrator and that odd number.
Okay. All right. Well, let's see here. Let's see. We have kind of a long question in the chat. We finished this a little early, so we may have time to look at it.
I see a couple chat items coming forward. Could I address those, or is that not?
Yes, please. So we covered the top 2. So if you see, there's one. Bruce is asking, is this just for firefighters or for all city unions?
Yeah, I think the first one we addressed about the community standards, unless there's a follow-up question to that. It says here on chapter 174, district judge standard is prevailing wages for firefighters in private sector. That's true. And so how they do that is really kind of amazing to me. So there's 2 ways you can look at comparables when you're trying to decide if wages and benefits are higher or lower in a particular area compared to other areas. And one's called results-oriented comparables, where people go in and nitpick the data to try to make their case, and it's very biased. The other way is what they call objective comparables. And I'm reading a book right now on interest arbitration, which is synonymous for binding arbitration. And 10 of the 15 chapters are how to do objective comparables. And that's what the arbitrators are trained in, and is not being fooled by one side trying to basically influence the other. There's a very elaborate standard on how you develop, objective comparables. And so in the end, the arbitrator look at the objective comparables, the evidence from both sides. Again, look at the community standards and decide. And interesting enough, none of our impasses have been over wages and benefits. And I would suspect that Austin firefighters, I don't believe we're the highest paid, as a lot of people espouse, but I think we are. We're well compensated, and we appreciate that from the community. I think it'll be issues. It could be wages and benefits, but I think it'll be other issues that we sometimes reach impasse on that the arbitrator could help us on.
So there was a question sent privately to me that I think is really good, and it references a New York Times article about police in New York, but it does talk specifically about the imposition of laws that make compulsory binding arbitration. It says that if there is an impasse in contract negotiations, the average salaries of police and firefighters have risen far faster than other government employees and well above the rate of inflation. And local government officials, again, this isn't Austin, but in New York, complain that compulsory binding arbitration is bankrupting their communities by handing power over police salaries to an unelected police-friendly arbitrator. Again, it's specifically talking about police, but kind of the bigger question there with saying, does that mean the salaries for the firefighters could rise faster than inflation and than other government employees?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think it's apples to oranges because when you look at the Northeast, particularly, binding arbitration and collective bargaining are very different and very labor friendly. In Texas, that's just not the case. Nothing's labor friendly in Texas. So I don't know that that's a fair comparison, but let's just look at recent experience study in Austin. So we have a 5-year contract, and over the last 5 years, we were awarded a 6.25% raise. I don't think anybody would say that even keeps up with inflation, let alone exceeding inflation. So, you know, we're not, again, wages are not our biggest issue, but I just, you know, as an example, I think that shows that, you know, they don't rise. And the only way they could rise under an arbitrator is he looked at the comparables, the evidence from both sides and the community standard, and then decided that we were underpaid and deserved a pay raise. So, you know, like I said earlier, I think there's studies that show that negotiatings in general have an upward bias for wages and benefits, but binding arbitration, when you look at public and private sector, doesn't appear to produce that effect.
Thank you. There are some more questions in the chat, but I think we are at our time where we need to move on. So let's just do one final summary of this just to make it clear. A yes vote on Prop A will require both the City of Austin and the Austin Firefighters Association to enter in binding arbitration when one of them wants to, if there is a stalemate in contract negotiations. A no will keep the status quo, and that means that one group can ask to go to binding arbitration, but it's not required of the other group.
That's a fair statement, yes.
Okay. Well, Bob, thank you so much for joining us today. If there's any other questions in the chat that was sent to everyone, you're welcome to type in some answers as we move on to Prop B.
Okay, and I'll put in my contact information. Anybody who wants to contact me,
All right.
you know, think about it later on. Thanks for having us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bob. And thanks, those are really good questions folks sent in as well. Okay, on to Prop B. I want to give a little roadmap for how we're going to do this one, as we do have 2 speakers here to talk about both sides. We want to make sure everybody gets equal time. So to start off, I'm going to give a couple of slides of background information about what the current policy is of the law in the City of Austin. And then we are happy to have Cleo Patricek here from Save Austin Now, who will be representing the pro Prop B side, and Heidi Sloan from Homes Not Handcuffs will be representing the con Prop B side. And so basically we're going to start off with similar questions to both of them. How did this get on the ballot, and what coalitions brought that together, and what coalitions came together to oppose? And then we're going to ask each of the speakers, why should you vote yes, or why should you vote no? And then we're going to have a flip of the same question here at the end for Save Austin Now. If this passes and recriminalizes homelessness, what's kind of the end goal there? For Homes Not Handcuffs, if this fails and the status quo stays the same, what's the end goal? And then I think we'll have some questions from the floor. And after the questions from the floor, we'll give both sides 30 seconds to kind of make a closing statement before we go on to Prop C. So let me do a couple of slides of background information. There's 2 things that have happened with this that's important for everybody to know. First is that in 2019, the Austin City Council voted unanimously to repeal an ordinance that was on the books that prohibited sitting, lying, or panhandling in the downtown area. And that was repealed unanimously by everyone on council. A second part on that same day wasn't unanimous. It was a 9-2 vote with council members Alter and Tovo opposing. They voted to prohibit camping in public areas only if a person was a danger to themselves or to the public, or was blocking a sidewalk or property. So essentially what that means is that camping was made legal except in these 2 cases, okay? There has been a change in policy since then, because about 2 months ago in February 2021, the city passed the HEAL initiative, and that is an acronym that stands for Housing Focused Homeless Encampment Assistance Link. And basically, it's a plan that asks the city manager to implement and fund an initiative to connect people experiencing homelessness to housing-focused services and supports, with the goal of removing the camps from 4 particular focus areas: South Central Austin at major intersections, overpasses, medians, and sidewalks. East Austin on sidewalks, public easements, and libraries. The Central Business District on what they say major arterial routes, so I'm guessing the major thoroughfares. And Northwest Austin at an intersection adjacent to vehicular pedestrian traffic. The city manager has a 6-month timeline to implement this. But this last part's really important. He was given the charge to clear the encampments without involving police or issuing citations. The reason that's really the crux of it is because Prop B is talking about making this a criminalizing it so that, in other words, you could give somebody a ticket who was doing this, okay? So right now they're trying to clear certain areas, but not through using the police and not through issuing citations. Prop B then wants to make it a criminal offense. It basically wants to take it back to what it was before 2019. Okay, so here is the language that's on here. And it says it would create a criminal offense and penalty for sitting or lying down on a public sidewalk or sleeping outdoors in or near the downtown area University of Texas campus, and go on to create a criminal offense and penalty for solicitation, which is like colloquially known as panhandling, defined as requesting money and goes through there if done in an aggressive manner. So what we have right now is some of this in the HEAL initiative, but not kind of, I would argue, the most important part of Prop B, which is that there's a ticket and a criminal enforcement behind it. Okay, and if either of y'all kind of disagree with my explanation there, please, we'll have plenty of time to go into that. So Cleo, thank you so much for joining us. I kind of want to start off here with how did this get on the ballot and what groups or coalitions worked to get it on the ballot?
It's with SaveAustinNowPAC.com. I got involved through my nonprofit of SafeProject.com. We raised 26,000 signatures across the city during a pandemic. Obviously, there was overwhelming support, even with the pandemic, in organizing this and also collecting certified signatures. I got involved with this because I was noticing in South Austin near me, in a community a little about 15 minutes away, a majority Hispanic community there was an increase of encampments, and I felt that there was no one speaking out for them. So I organized several community meetings. And at that time I asked for the Councilman Renteria and Kitchens to attend, but they refused to attend. At that time, I met with parents, teachers, school officials, and they all gave these alarming stories of harassment, public defecation, drug needles on playgrounds and parks. And now, ever since the pandemic, parks have been taken over, where children who, a lot of these communities, low-income communities, live in apartments, so they don't have a playground to play. So that is why I got involved with Safe Project and definitely partnered with Matt to bring this forth as a petition into a ballot initiative.
All right, thank you. Heidi Sloan from Homes Not Handcuffs. So once that got on the ballot, what groups or coalitions came together to oppose this proposition?
Yeah, absolutely. So a little background here, even prior to the ballot initiative, Homes Not Handcuffs was an active coalition advocating for housing-focused solutions to homelessness in Austin, and very active in the original repeal of the ordinances in 2019 that you mentioned. And immediately when those ordinances were repealed, literally the next day, we saw folks like President Trump and Republicans around the state saying that homelessness had immediately skyrocketed. So we as a coalition knew that that information was being spread, that false information was being spread from the get-go, and that we would continue to have to respond to that. So we didn't take off our coalition hat at that point, have continued to advocate for those housing-focused solutions around Austin that don't include criminalization. Now, as this is on the ballot, a lot of our 501c3s have different relationships with the coalition because, honestly, because of their funding streams and how they are organized. So our coalition, though it looks a little different than it did back in 2019, includes such incredible advocates as folks on city council like Natasha Harper Madison, Greg Kassar, lots and lots of city council members, Mike Siegel, Julie Oliver, the Working Families Party, Texas Appleseed, Indivisible, the Travis County Democratic Party, DSA, and lots of individuals who have signed up to be part of this push for housing and not criminalization, for homes and not handcuffs. And we continue to advocate for that, not just in this ballot election, but very often at City Council. I think Cleo and I have a lot of the same critiques of City Council and how homelessness is managed in this city. And so we show up not just for May 1st, but regularly to push for the solutions we know are actually needed to address homelessness without putting people in jail, without using handcuffs and the threat of criminalization.
Thank you. Cleo, kind of the main question everybody wants to know on both sides. So why should folks vote yes on Prop B?
So I completely agree with Heidi. Putting this as a Democrat or Republican, you know, we're both liberals, so this has nothing to do with politics or Trump or anything like that. This has to do with what the city council did before June 2019, you know, their policies that got them to this point, and after June 2019. There's no disagreement that we have a homeless epidemic. The ballot is asking the voters if they feel that the current approach taken by the city is acceptable. I believe that the majority of Austinites believe both, that it is not acceptable and that Austin should be focused on rapid deployment of resources to get people safe places to go. There are people who have no intention of complying and living in a housing situation that requires a significant level of responsibility. And then there are those that are trying to get out of a bad situation to a place where they can be responsible and move on with their lives. We have to deal with both in appropriate ways. Disruptive tent communities are not the answer to either case. There is no disagreement that the city of Austin should provide housing and camping locations for homeless. We all agree. This ballot is about what the homeless are doing right now. Should they be allowed to live in lawlessness and filth, disrupting the public good or not? There is no disagreement in what should happen in the long run or what the city should have done 2 years ago, but that's not what the ballot initiative is about. We have no disagreement about what the city should do. Heidi has made her career choice to advocate for people who should be able to disrupt the public good, who should be able to live in filth and squalor. I've made a choice to advocate for kids like 10-year-old Amelia, who's pleading our state representatives to do something about her community that is no longer safe. I encourage all of you guys to watch the testimony at the Capitol this past Thursday. She explained how her and people I met at the community meetings, their lives have been upended because of what the city of Austin has chose to allow for people to live in ways that infringe on their schoolyards, leaving paraphernalia behind, committing illicit acts in public. Even the city admits that their current plan isn't working. It's not fair to kids and communities. It is un-American and it is wrong. What we need to have is short-term proposals from the city that target housing in substantial numbers for people of various type of conditions. We need safe places for people to go who are nonconformists and have no intention of being in traditional housing situations, and housing options for families and individuals who are on hard times and want a dignified place to stay and get back on their feet. The city did not focus its initial efforts on housing options when it embarked on this now failed experiment 2 years ago. It has muddled around with its half-baked ideas to house a small number of people and try to peddle the idea that everyone currently living on the street desires the same type of housing solution. This is what happens when real leadership doesn't exist on an issue and narrowly concerned activism is substituted in its place. You can't assume that ignoring the needs of virtually the entire population of Austin is going to end well. Complex problems can't be solved like this.
Thank you, Cleo. Heidi, so the exact opposite question. Why should folks vote no on Prop B?
Absolutely. So I've worked in services for people experiencing homelessness and exiting homelessness for the last 8 years of my life. And Cleo is absolutely correct when she says I've made a career out of this. It is my heart and my passion, and I am able to draw on people's lived experiences in reference to how this deployment of resources would actually play out. For one thing, I just want to note that this homeless epidemic has been part of our living experience as Austinites for many, many years, that the rate of increase from 2019 to 2020 was only 11%, which is not anything outside of the normal rate of increase year to year previously when these ordinances were in effect. The ordinances did not decrease homelessness. They did not solve the problem. We had them in place for decades and they did not work. So that's a note for everyone to just understand that that the epidemic didn't come from the ordinance change, and it's not going to go away if this ballot measure passes. Secondly, let's talk about the deployment, the rapid deployment of resources, about connecting people with housing that is appropriate to their needs and to services that meet them where they are. When someone is sleeping out in a city where camping is banned, they are having to literally hide. They are having to avoid tickets, which lead to fines that oftentimes they cannot pay because they are in the experience of homelessness right now, which leads to warrants, which leads to court cases. And the vast majority of tickets that go out to people experiencing homelessness in Austin in 2017 and previously when these ordinances were in effect, did in fact go to warrants. Now, Cleo will tell you, and this is true, that some people who get a warrant end up at the downtown Austin criminal court. Some of them also end up at the Austin municipal court. But in either case, you know, there are some incredible judges who are willing to work with someone and connect them with resources to give them an option to work off the time instead of paying a fine or going to jail because they can't pay the fine because they're too poor to pay the fine. But even in that best case scenario, when someone is doing public service to work off a ticket for living somewhere that they are absolutely forced to live because they have no other option because the city doesn't have enough affordable housing, that does not mean that that individual is being connected with services. Whether they're getting a ticket or a warrant, whether they are going to jail or they're doing community service, all of these are ways of delaying someone from being able to do things like go to their job, to make an income that will help them recover, to meet with their caseworkers, which is a huge challenge for people already when they're having to hide in woods and coverts and back alleyways where they cannot be found because they don't want to be found, because being found means interacting with the police and having this whole process start over. But most importantly, when someone is forced to camp in hiding, which is what this Prop B would do, force people back into hiding, they lose their place on the housing wait list. If they go to jail, they automatically lose that place. If they are delayed, if they can't pay their down payment, if they can't make their rent because they're having to go to court, because they're losing their job, because they have to prioritize community service instead, because they have this fine to pay, they're losing their place on a housing wait list. Grassroots Leadership did a study of people who are ticketed for this very offense prior to the ordinance change in 2019. And what we found was actually that people who are ticketed for sleeping outside are kept from services, are kept from recovery. Prop B makes the problem worse because it keeps people from connecting with the life-giving care, relationships, and opportunities that they would need to actually recover from homelessness. Now, of course, we don't disagree around the housing issue at all, and we have to continue to push for that. But solutions to housing, to toilets, to trash disposal, all of these are things that we as advocates at the city can continue to strive for, but criminalization makes us go backwards.
So I think you both brought up really good points, and I want to take pieces and kind of ask you to respond to them. So Cleo, a part of what Heidi's talking about, and we've had some folks asking in the chat, is if this passes and recriminalizes homelessness, what's the end goal? Say a ticket is given, then there's a court appearance, folks potentially don't show for a myriad of issues, and a warrant could eventually be issued, then they could be taken to jail, but you can't hold folks in jail pre-trial because they're indigent, so then they're let out and the cycle repeats, except now the person has a record or could be along the way to getting a record, which could potentially make housing harder. So if this passes, like Save Austin now hopes, what's kind of the end goal? Do we think it will actually solve the camping problem?
Well, when I met with the mayor almost 2 years ago, there were certain things that we definitely begged for, like immediate camping locations that were safe, that were provided toilets, provided water, a place to store their things that were safe, that service providers could locate them. And the mayor at that time admitted that if we did that, then that we could never take the locations away. So obviously that's a terrible answer. He knew 2 years ago of the impact of having encampments all across Austin near children, and flat out, there should not be camping locations near children. Children should not be seen in these predominantly Hispanic communities. I grew up in one of these communities. I grew up on food stamps. My parents are both Mexican immigrants. I am a former probation officer and worked in social service my entire adult life. But I refuse to accept that the way that they're living in filth and squalor is what we want for the homeless community. We all care about the homeless community. Having them live this way it's enabling this type of behavior. It's not solving the problem. The point is to get to housing solutions. But while we're getting there, we can't continue to have these disruptors and the mess that the city has created. This is what this ballot initiative is actually about. It's not about whether or not we believe that homeless people should have housing. We all believe that. The fact is, Heidi and I agree on this issue, and many others. We are both liberals and we see eye to eye on a lot of this. What we disagree with is if this chaos that has been created, the loss of amenities, the subjecting of kids to the behavior that they should be subjected to is acceptable, and if it's solving this problem. I believe it is unacceptable, and Heidi believes it's acceptable. Voting yes on this proposition is about forcing the city to restore order, decency for families, and start focusing on what they should have focused almost 2 years ago, which is viable housing options for people who need them short-term and long-term, erecting temporary structures, like a wartime. We need to treat this like we are at war. We need to find immediate solutions even the mayor admits that these retrofitting hotels and getting them ADA compliant and all that will take years. But in the meantime, they live in no man's land. They live without any type of order, without any type of safety. Homeless women are being victimized daily. People who mean harm, people who sell drugs to them migrate to these communities because they know the lack of enforcement. In all areas, we should not continue this. And the only reason the mayor admitted that their plan is failing is because we put this proposition forward. We are the only ones holding the city and homeless organizations accountable. We all agree that long-term housing and housing options are the answer. Unfortunately, that really isn't where this problem originated. This activist crowd did not focus their efforts on serious plans for housing, and this camping thing has become an enormous distraction. It clearly doesn't work. Mayor Adler admitted it doesn't work. Now, all this time has been wasted. All this activist energy has been wasted talking about a camping ban. The ballot gives the citizens a chance to reset and force this debate to real solutions. Again, when this camping ban was in effect, we had majority compliance, something like 98% compliance. And as a probation officer, I strongly believe in using community resources and diverting people especially children, in the least restrictive environment. That means getting them to services, drug offenders to drug treatment, women who have been assaulted to victim treatment. All of these things we cannot do if they are in camping tents. And what we know is a lot of these people that were in shelters, as news statesmen and other media agents have reported, many of them walked out from their drug treatment and their shelters when this camping ban was lifted. They chose to, and like we had several that we interviewed admit, hey, why would I go to a shelter when I can live on the street for free? We even had Haven for Hope, a successful agency in San Antonio that offers a triage of services in the city of San Antonio that has been successful. He even supports the camping ban. We have homeless organizations that support this because they know we need compliance. We need homeless individuals to know that we all are all living this social contract of living in a city, abiding by law. Okay, we cannot have that if we have this lawlessness happening all across the streets. But what hurts me the most is that it's happening in communities of color, low-income communities where children do not have playgrounds and places to play. And that what hurts me the most, because I think everyone should be an activist for that. Everyone should say, hey, we need to have neighborhoods safe again. We need to have communities protected from lawlessness, from drugs, from paraphernalia, stepping on paraphernalia, seeing illicit behavior, not just using the bathroom. We're talking about actual explicit sex acts are happening in front of these children. And this is not hyperbole. I can give you names and interview children that I have met with that this has happened to.
Thank you. So Heidi, I want to take what Cleo's talking about on the public safety argument. I'm also seeing this in the chat a lot. So if Prop B fails and the status quo legally stays the same, what's the end goal? So we know that you've talked about moving toward housing for these individuals, but we've seen that that can be time intensive and costly, and some folks may not be interested or don't qualify. So the camps continue. Citizens feel concerned about safety and sanitation. Flooding and the health of individuals at the camp is in jeopardy. So if this prop fails, like Homes Not Handcuffs hopes, what's the end goal and how can we address those public safety issues?
I really appreciate the comments in the chat and the deep compassion that people are expressing for our folks who are our unhoused neighbors right now. Let me be really clear that Prop B, and you have the language in front of you right now, does nothing to address public safety issues. That prior to 2019, I mean, just let's use logic here. If someone is not allowed to camp in public, and yet we have the same number of people experiencing homelessness, where do they go? And I want to be also really clear that folks experiencing homelessness are much more likely to be victims of violent crime than perpetrators of violent crime. And yet we still have this question of where do people go under a Prop B? Into hiding, but where specifically? The places that Cleo mentioned right now, places like playgrounds, that's already illegal. Folks can't camp in parks or near schools. And whether that's being enforced or not is a question that we should raise at council and hold people accountable for. But that is on the books at this very moment. In terms of what Cleo keeps calling filth and squalor, and I call, human dignity and safety, I think that we have every opportunity to demand that, knowing that human beings have to go to the bathroom, that we should be providing public bathrooms, especially in a pandemic. This is the CDC recommendation. And let me tell you, if you are interested in advocating for that at the city, I will go with you. I have done it before. We have to keep pushing. If you were talking about trash, the city has partnered in placing these specific, it was like a trial run of trash bags, purple bags. If you've driven by downtown, you've probably seen them at select locations where folks who are camping can put their waste and not have their tents torn down or their personal belongings accidentally swept away. And that is something that we should be advocating for everywhere. Prop B doesn't do that. Prop B doesn't give us bathrooms. Prop B doesn't make playgrounds more safe. Prop B pushes people into hiding. And if we're talking about housing, if this passes, if Austin votes to send people back into the woods, to send people back into the creek beds, then when it comes time for those apartments to be open, which again, if you want to advocate for more housing to be built in Austin, please, I'll put our contact information in the chat. We turn out hundreds of people to testify every city council meeting where housing is on the docket. But when it comes time for folks to be allowed to move into that newly built or newly found housing, they're not going to have case managers. They're not going to be locatable. They're actually, because of the long history of Austin pre-2019, moving people from place to place and basically just chasing them around town until they could ticket them and put them in jail, they're not going to want to be found. We know that for a fact. And if we want people to move into housing, we have to start giving them services now. So things I'm really excited about. The world we're trying to build together, right? Looks like Texas state jails not being the largest provider of mental health services anymore. Actually getting more caseworkers and mental health services available for us in the community right now for folks experiencing homelessness and those who are not. We're making progress on that. Right now, if you call 911, you can ask for a mental health first aid provider in addition to police and firefighters. So it's not perfect. Can you jump on that and help us? Absolutely, you can. More housing, but housing that is meeting people where they are in a relationship that is already built on trust, that is working with all of the homeless service providers that are currently in Austin. And if you look at the past experience of Homes Not Handcuffs, right? Of course, with the Ballot initiative, like I said, with 501c3s, it gets complicated, but they're with us. They don't want a camping ban. So let's be real about what Prop B does and does not do.
Thank you. So I want to get to a couple of the questions, and don't worry, we'll both have closing statements, and I think we'll have enough time to do a 1-minute closing statement instead of 30 seconds. So one is kind of a technical process question, and I myself am not sure of the answer, but several folks have asked, who's going to determine, and y'all may not know that, and you're not necessarily supposed to, but who's going to determine the criminal penalty? Is it the city council? Does anybody know the answer to that process question?
No, I would think it would just be the exact same criminal penalty that was beforehand.
Right, which I believe was a Class C. Is that sound right? Okay. So just for the folks on the call who may not be familiar, a Class C doesn't have jail time associated with it. So it's not, so that's important to note that it's a non-jailable offense. Now, that doesn't mean if you commit a Class C that you'll never end up in jail, because if you don't show up for your court date and you continually don't show up, then something can be issued to take you to jail. So you're not in jail for the Class C, you're in jail for failing to appear. So Class C doesn't give you jail time, but sometimes folks who don't appear end up in jail. So that question was in the chat. So one thing is there is a ton of really good ideas and questions going on in the chat about ways we can handle homelessness in Austin and ideas, but I want to kind of pinpoint on the proposition and about whether or not to criminalize. So thank you for those ideas. Maybe this opens itself up to a future program where we have kind of a broader discussion. But one question that's come up quite a bit in the news is the city says that certain areas are not allowed to have camping in them, like sidewalks can't be blocked, trails can't be blocked. But we have a lot of folks saying in the chat and in general that that's not necessarily being enforced. So I guess the question would be, is it supposed to be enforced now and it's just not being? And why is that? I mean, I'm not saying you need to be able to solve that problem necessarily, but also then does that mean if this passes, would this be enforced as well? So kind of like an enforcement question. I think we can hear from both of y'all for 30 seconds. So go ahead, Cleo.
For me, it is because the city is overwhelmed and they admitted they don't have a short-term or long-term plan. And the plan right now that they have is failing. We begged on June 2019 for the city council to please hire a homeless strategy officer before they made any moves. They ignored us and they voted, and then we spent almost a year and a half almost without a homeless strategy officer. That is complete nonsense. When you see how serious this has impacted our entire city, every part of our city is impacted by this. It's the compliance for me. And how would answer the enforcement of parks and areas where they are not supposed to be camping, and common spaces. She had mentioned the schoolyards. you know, it's after the fact. Kids are stepping on drug needles or see them and, you know, don't know what to do with them. They're seeing sexual acts. It's already happened and it's gone and kids are traumatized. That's, of course, it's illegal. Of course, you shouldn't use drugs on campus, but you know, it's after it's already done. So for me, it's the compliance where we have people who choose to live on tents and choose not to be in shelters, choose to have walked out of shelters that were provided for them when this camping ban was placed. And we also have individuals where they have migrated here from other cities and other states. Okay, this has become another hotspot, just like Portland, Seattle, California, Los Angeles. All of these places have tried this failed experiment of the camping, allowing camping everywhere. And what this is, I do not know why we would follow cities that have failed instead of following cities that have been successful, like San Antonio and Haven for Hope, founder, CEO, who was here a couple days ago that mentioned that he supports this camping ban. Okay, why we're not following people who are successful and then listening to activists, it's beyond me, especially because we had no strategy officer for a year and a half. So Heidi and I, we should all enable all of our resources and attention to what a city council has not done. They have not had a plan. Their current plan is failing, and they do not have a plan for the short term for people who do not want to be housed in structures like a shelter where there's rules where you have to abide by drug treatment, mental health. There is no plan for that. I've begged and asked for Mayor Adler to tell me, what are we going to do for the non-compliant, those who do not want to be housed in a structure? Can we please have sanctioned campgrounds? Can we have places so they're not living, and yes, I will say it again, filth and squalor. I have house homeless in this home and refugees in my home. I do want them to live better than they are. We all agree on that, but that the way that they're living in a non-compliant, without any basics provided to them, without any type of enforcement, where women are being victimized, I will not let that happen on my watch, because I am a mom and I care about my community, every part of it. And I not only say it, but I actually do it. So I also want to say, if I have time, if you look at this experiment, this is an experiment and we should not continue that. We had compliance beforehand, I'll repeat again, and we need to go back to how it was before, where we didn't have people being, this is not criminalization of being homeless. Homelessness is not a crime, okay? The behavior behind these tent structures is the problem. It is impacting communities of color, low-income communities that do not right now have access to amenities. That is the problem here.
Thank you, Cleo. I want to give Heidi a chance to respond, and then there's one more question I want us to cover in the chat, and it's more of a procedural one. And then each person, due to time, will have a 30-second closing statement. So Heidi, on that question about, certain places are not supposed to have camping sites, and yet it seems like there's lax enforcement. And what's your response to that?
It's a great question. It's a really legitimate question. So enforcement of Class C misdemeanor prohibition, just like enforcement of any Class C misdemeanor prohibition, comes through the police. That is the only mechanism for law enforcement in this city. Of course, people can be reminded by other citizens, but ultimately it comes down to the Austin Police Department, and they're not doing that. Right now, I agree, like in a lot of cases, in a lot of circumstances, they're not responding to those public reports in the way that they would be expected to, according to, what is on the books at the present moment. Now, whether that is because, the motivation behind it is a huge question, right? And if it would change, if criminalization was, if Prop B was passed, I don't know. They might decide that that is something that they would be more willing or able to enforce, but I can't speak for them. I can just tell you how it is right now. I will say that once again, the increase in homelessness between when the ordinances were changed and the following year was on the same consistent pattern as prior years. And this whole notion that folks are moving to Travis County to be homeless has been debunked time and time again. The vast majority of people experiencing homelessness in Travis County come from Travis County. And there has always been 20 to 30% who are coming from elsewhere, but mostly in Texas. And that continues to be the case according to every service provider who actually can do polling on that scale or case management on that scale. And as far as people exiting shelter systems and going and living on the streets, I think that if we find circumstances of that being verifiably true, we should be asking ourselves what is going on in our shelters. How can we make these spaces better? But to remind that Prop B doesn't create more shelter spaces. And so if we are criminalizing people, we are not able to say, instead of living in this tent, whether it is under an overpass in the woods, you should go to this other place. We don't have that in Austin. We don't have housing. We don't have open shelter beds. We are just telling them they should go to jail. That is the only other option besides tents. We don't have another place that we could be saying you would be better off here. Everything is always full. I mean, we know that to be the case, right? You guys know that in the community, this is what we see, and it's more visible now, but that's because people are coming into the light and to these places that they consider more safe to be, rather than in the culverts, in the woods, and in places where they know that they're, that they're unfindable.
Thank you. So we do have one technical question. We may not know the answer, but maybe somebody will know in the chat as well, that I think is really important because of the language of Prop B, is where exactly is this going to ban camping? Is it going to ban camping citywide, or is it just adding areas to the HEAL proposition, including around the University of Texas downtown, which is specified? I've kind of seen things showing that it's only one area and that's the whole city. Do y'all have any idea on that?
It's reinstating the law on public camping citywide. So that means every part, not just, they're just going to migrate to an increase into other areas. We need to have the ban all across the city. No neighborhood should be exclusive. Downtown shouldn't have the right to have be able to walk freely and not be accosted or anything like that compared to South Austin.
Cleo, I think that's right too. And I think some of the confusion in the ballot in the prop comes from, it's kind of specifying sitting and lying in downtown areas in University of Texas. But if you look at the last part of the prop, it does say camping anywhere not designated by the Parks and Recreation Department. So I think that's a correct statement that it would outlaw camping, at least in the entire city. Heidi, does that sound right to you?
That's absolutely right. I wanted to point out exactly what you just pointed out, that sitting and lying is on here as well. And I just think this is an incredibly humane turn of phrase, that people are not allowed to sit or lie down in certain parts of our city. I've seen it in action. And so please note that that is part of this too. We can't parcel it out, and it would be enforced in these specific areas, not like the HEAL initiative, and also not like the HEAL initiative is not attached to like housing focused shelters. So it's really distinct entities here.
Yes, it's kind of three parts, which is the sitting and lying, the aggressive soliciting or panhandling, it's kind of known, but aggressive panhandling, not just somebody necessarily asking you for money, and then the camping ban. So this has been a really good discussion. There was so much good stuff in the chat. I'm sorry we can't get to all of it, but I do want to give you both the opportunity to make a closing statement. So Cleo, can you kind of give us your final pitch for why folks should vote for Prop A? And we'll do 1 minute on this.
I also want to say that the homeless population has doubled, and Google Statesman article or other media publications, and they will show you, they've interviewed people that have come from other parts of the city and state because they're thinking it's favorable to be able to camp wherever you want, and there aren't any laws enforcing safety for all. So what this is about is voting yes on Proposition B. It's about whether people should or should not be allowed to camp anywhere and disrupt schoolyards, playgrounds, parks, and sidewalks. Everyone can see what's happening, and even the mayor sees that it's not working. We all agree on the need for long-term housing solutions for people in the city. We all know about gentrification. We all know about the increase in property taxes, about people like teachers who can't even afford to live in this community. It's time to focus on real solutions to challenge the challenges and its challenges and puts this failed strategy behind us. It's time that we vote yes on Prop B. When the city admitted that it wasn't working, which was shocking that they did that, only when we brought in this initiative, everyone knew it wouldn't work. And they still decided that they should do this experiment 2 years ago. Now, instead of going back to square one and starting over with their plan that will work, they want to defend this stupid decision and have endless public debate about who and who isn't sensitive enough to the needs of the homeless. When what this is really about is whether or not people should be allowed to sit, camp, and lie, and to infringe on schoolyards, to infringe on the public amenities, and remove them from our use, all because of a very small group of people who chose a lifestyle of lawlessness are allowed to do with the city's consent. That is what this is about.
Thank you, Cleo. And Heidi, you can do 1.5 minutes for your closing statement there.
Thanks so much. I appreciate the opportunity, and I especially appreciate the chat. Again, I'll drop some information in there before I leave. The root causes of homelessness, as we all know, are the inability to survive a brutal economic system in which minimum wage doesn't keep up with housing costs, in which healthcare is not provided to the vast majority of people to meet their basic needs. It is the ramifications of a brutal and defunded public education system. It is part of Austin, unfortunately. It is not a choice that people make to be lawless. And if you spend time with people, you know, once you're building that trust, the vast majority of people absolutely want to be part of that system again. But it is really hard to convince someone once they have been pushed so far out that they are welcome, that they are not hated and despised and outcast. Our job, if we want to heal this city, is to make sure that our unhoused neighbors know for certain that we have their backs, that we're advocating for their basic human needs and human dignity, and that we are not going to rely on the criminal justice system to be the social safety net anymore. It is a failure at that. It has been a failure at that. This is the war on poverty, my friends, and it doesn't work. What works is being a good neighbor. What works is showing up and advocating for real solutions, continuing that long, hard road that I know that Austin can do if we continue to advocate, if we continue to let our neighbors be seen, be cared for, and be connected to. We are voting no on Prop B, and we are doing it knowing full well that that commits us to a longer, stronger path together to actually solve this problem.
Well, thank you both very much. This is an enormously complex and nuanced and emotional issue. And I think there was a lot of really good points and back and forth, which is kind of why we do this and what we want, right? And thank you, everybody. Lots of good information going on in the chat. We are going to move on to Prop C, which is going to be quite short in comparison to this, but we do have another guest speaker coming up for Prop G that we want to make sure we're able to get to. So Cleo, Heidi, thank you very much for participating today. All right, folks, that is only one out of the many propositions on the ballot that you'll be voting for this May. Prop C. This is the only proposition on the ballot that did not come from a ballot initiative. It was initiated by folks on the city council. So what is it and what does it do? And we don't have a speaker for this prop, so I am just going to show you what folks have been saying in the news, both for and against it. So shall the city charter be amended to allow for a director of police oversight to be appointed or removed in a manner established by the city council ordinance, with duties that include the responsibility to ensure transparency and accountability as it relates to policing. Okay, so what does that mean? Currently, the Office of Police Oversight is an administrative department that reports to the city manager, okay, not the city council. The mission of the office, its purpose, is to provide impartial oversight of the Austin Police Department's conduct, practices, and policies. And the director of the department is appointed by the city manager. So basically, Proposition C, if passed, would allow the city council to change how the director of police oversight is appointed or removed. And it doesn't actually say how they're going to be appointed or removed. It just gives them flexibility to do different things with the appointment or removal. And what that means is the city manager would no longer manage the department. The city council could manage the department, or they could make a neutral board to manage the department. So it's like a change in the charter that would allow for either one of these things to happen. So where did this come from, and what are folks saying on both sides? So Councilmember Greg Kassar is one of the folks that's really been advocating for Prop C. And the statement he released not too long ago says, in other cities, the Office of Police Oversight is independently appointed or is overseen by a civilian board. But right now, our options as a city are limited. What he means is the charter says the city manager will appoint it. So that's the only thing that can happen currently. By making this proposed charter change in May, the community and city council have the opportunity to create more transparency and accountability of our police department in the future. So essentially, he's saying this would give the city more flexibility in how they manage this department, in hopes that it would allow more accountability for this department to oversee the police, and could make the department more neutral because maybe they're being chosen by a board or a commission instead of by the city manager. So what are folks on the con side saying? A council member, Mackenzie Kelly from District 6, stated, I think this is a great idea in theory, but I have very strong opposition to possibly amending the charter so quickly without insight and collaboration in the community. So kind of the cons of this proposition from folks who are putting those out there is that this was a rushed process and didn't include the appropriate amount of stakeholder input. And what stakeholders are they talking about? Like the police association, for example. Councilmember Kassar responded back to this and said he kind of agrees and wishes there would have been more time for community input. But you can only update the city charter, I think it's every so often, I believe it's every 2 years. So because these citizen petition ballots came through and have to go on the ballot, the choice was to put this on the ballot now or wait 2 years. And he felt like, in his words, he didn't want to let the moment pass, that would be too long to make this decision. There hasn't been a lot of public opposition to this, mainly just some procedural things. On the other end, you have had a couple of people saying, this really doesn't give the Office of Police Oversight any more bite. And what we mean by that is any more power to observe and help make better policies and procedures for the police than it already has. So kind of a moot point. So that's another con, some folks are saying. Does anybody have a question on Prop C? It's definitely been one of the ones that hasn't been in the news so much because it's a little technical. But if you have anything, I'll give you about 30 more seconds to pop it in there, and I will try my best to answer it or we will pass it along. You guys in the chat are actually doing a really good job at answering a lot of these questions, so I always like that when I have a lot of smart people who are super involved in the city there to ask questions to during the presentation. If you come up with a question for a Prop C, go ahead and put it in the chat because we may be able to get to it to the end. But we're at the point of our presentation where who collected the signatures for Prop C? Great question. It was not a citizen ballot initiative. It actually came from the city council to put it on the ballot. So it had a different process for how it got. So no signatures collected. Good question. So we are going to move on to Prop G, and we do have a guest speaker with us. So Andrew, I saw that you're on. If you would like to pop on and say hi.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Yes, hi Andrew, welcome. Thank you for joining us. So let's go over Prop G. There's a little bit of background information we want to give you because I know a lot of folks are very interested in that strong mayor proposition and kind of all the governance positions, but many of them were covered last week. So we do have guest speaker Andrew Allison here today, and he's the chair for Austinites for Progressive Reform. Andrew joined Common Ground for Texans last week to discuss the rest of the props, including the strong mayor prop. You can find that recording on our website, and there was a really great discussion between Andrew and Jason Lopez, president of the Austin Central Labor Council, kind of going back and forth on these governance propositions here. So Andrew, for Prop G, we want to start by asking how this got on the ballot and who the stakeholders were involved in the ballot initiatives, and then kind of asked to explain why folks should vote for Prop G. We don't have a person representing the con side. So just like I did with Bob, I'm going to pop in and give a list of cons. Again, these are not my cons or the League of Women Voters. These are kind of like what's been put out in the news by different folks. Before we do that, I do want to note one procedural thing that I think a lot of you might be thinking about here. How will this council district be drawn if this passes? Andrew does not get to draw the ballot. The district would be drawn by the City of Austin Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission based on 2020 census data. So that's something to kind of keep in your mind as we move forward. So with that, let's get started. Andrew, how did this get on the ballot and who were the stakeholders involved?
Thanks very much, Jessica, and thanks to everyone for having me back to discuss this final ballot proposition. We, as you may remember from last week, we are a democracy reform campaign, and we are responsible for 5 of the propositions on the ballot. This is one of them. Our goal is to make Austin the most pro-democracy city in the country, and our reforms are all geared towards making Austin's local government more representative, responsive, diverse, and accountable to the people that it serves. Our coalition is broad. 100 local leaders have come together to work to support this campaign. People like Nelson Linder, the president of our local NAACP. People like Robbie Osley, who's been an advocate on many issues in Austin for decades, including reproductive freedom. People like Martha Cotera, who has been a longtime activist for our Latino communities here in Austin and elsewhere. And we all came together to advocate for democracy reform here in Austin. And the whole list of folks who are involved with the campaign is available at our website at austinprogress.org. So Proposition G, as Jessica explained, is about adding a council district to Austin, another geographic single-member council district. And the reason for that is that our population is growing very fast, as we all know. And if we do nothing about council districts, then by 2030, our districts will have 30% more people than they did when 10-1 went into effect just 6 years ago. And that means smaller voice for neighborhoods, for communities, for grassroots voices. It means less representation and less access to City Hall. It also means more expensive council races, which will leave out a lot of voices from the electoral process too. Adding a district will keep our council districts at a reasonable size like they are now. And on top of that, it will allow us to do 2 more things. One is strengthen our opportunity districts, which because of displacement and gentrification are at risk if nothing is done in the next decade. And it will also allow Austin to draw our first Asian American opportunity district. You know, our Asian American community is our fastest growing in Austin. It's nearly 10% of our population. And we have not had an Asian American member of council in more than 10 years, only ever had 1. So this also allows our council to reflect the full diversity of our city. So there are many reasons to add a district here, and the number 1 reason would be representation for all of us.
Great. So I want to talk about 2 different cons that have kind of been in the news and then let you to respond to each one of them. So Prop G is a part of several propositions, including strong mayor, ranked choice voting, the year the mayor is elected, and public campaign financing. I know there's been a lot of active discussion about strong mayor, along with Prop B. Those are definitely the two getting the most attention. But when you look at the different propositions surrounding governance, like all of these, including this one, a lot of opposition surrounding these measures has been about the process used to get them on the ballot. Oftentimes when a group wants a charter amendment, they bring it to the city and a commission is formed to study if it would be a good idea. So one con folks are saying is that these propositions, including G, weren't developed through this more open process. Instead, it was a small group of people, and they may have been presented to the public for voting before they had been thoroughly studied. Do you want to respond to that, Andrew?
Yes, I'd love to. As you pointed out earlier, Jessica, there are two ways to bring charter amendments to the public for a vote. And one of those is for the council to do it alone, or appoint a commission to do so, like what happened with Prop C, which was brought by the council. And the other option is for citizens to initiate a process and a petition to put these on the ballot. But our group was focused on democracy reform, of course, so we took that really seriously. And we looked to the city commission process as a guide. So we appointed a 15-person steering committee of local leaders from across Austin, very well-respected folks. And again, their names are available on our website. These are folks who didn't always agree on every issue all the time. They don't always agree on issues in Austin generally, but they came together to do something about our democracy. And it was really inspiring to see. So they wrote the reforms, the 5 propositions that are on the ballot, these 15 people. And the 60% people of color, more diverse than our last 2 city appointed charter commissions. But we didn't want the conversation to only happen in that room with 15 local leaders. We wanted to make sure that the public had a role in this process too, which again is not a requirement of any petition initiated process. Neither a commission or a committee nor a public engagement process is required, but we wanted to make sure that we involved the community. So we engaged 2 professional communications firms to run a robust and accessible community process where hundreds of people participated and gave feedback on the reforms. In fact, more people participated in that process than did during the last 2 city-run charter processes combined. So a lot of people participating, a lot of great feedback, which the steering committee of 15 leaders then incorporated in revising the proposals before they were final and put on a petition. And then ultimately, more than 20,000 Austin voters signed the petition in just about 3 weeks. It's one of the fastest petition drives in Austin history, which we think is a reflection of the demand we all feel around defending and strengthening our democracy. So that was a really critical part of our process. And I want to make sure to highlight just how expansive and considered these reforms were. I appreciate you pointing that out. The last thing I would add is that democracy reform typically happens this way, even in Austin. I'll note that our 10-1 system was brought by petition, much like ours was. It did not go through a city process. Our campaign contribution limits that keep our campaign contributions low was also brought originally by a petition. So petition has been the critical and in many cases only way to bring democracy reforms to the ballot. One example of that is that one of our reforms, which we talked about last week, so I won't go into it, is Proposition H about public financing of campaigns. And that was actually considered by a city-run charter commission and recommended by that commission by a vote of 7-3, but not put on the ballot ultimately by the council. So we brought it back, and I think the petition is an important way to get democracy reforms that are supported by the community onto the ballot.
Thank you. There's one more con I want to put out there and have your response, and then we do have some really good questions in the chat we'll have time to get to. So the second con that's kind of been in the news is that if this proposition passes, but the strong mayor proposition fails, there'll be an even number of votes on the council, which could result in more ties and possibly less things getting done and more antagonistic, potentially, council. Can you have anything to refute for that?
Sure. Well, first I'll point out that our steering committee considered that, and that's why the committee in our petition originally packaged this reform alongside the reform of our form of government to let voters choose the chief executive. It was the council that separated the two into Proposition F and Proposition G, which created the prospect of a tie. In our original proposal, the mayor would no longer be on the council, and that's true in Proposition F. The mayor would lose all legislative power in Proposition F, and we were going to replace that person on the council with this vote, but now they're separate. Nevertheless, we still support the passage of Prop G for all the representation reasons that we described earlier, because of our growth and the need to account for our growth and how we draw council districts. We may end up with occasional tie votes, but close votes are relatively rare on the council, and that may mean there's a little more need to compromise or find some common ground. Some council members have also indicated that if this passes and Prop F fails, then they will work to bring another council district to go back to an odd number of votes a few years from now. So we think it's certainly an issue that we considered and advised against, but now that it's on the ballot, the choice is between less representation or more, and we would recommend voting for this. And if tie votes become an issue, we can always fix that.
Okay, the first question I'd like to get to is more of a procedural one. So would the passage of Prop Z cause all districts to be redrawn? I think the answer to that is the districts are going to be redrawn anyway because of the census data. Am I right on that? Is that your understanding?
That's exactly right.
Okay, so whether or not Prop G, they're up for the traditional every 10 years once the census comes to be redrawn based on how many people live in what district. So yes, they would be drawn with an 11th district, but it's going to happen anyway. Next question, this is kind of two parts, but I think they're similar enough for you to get them in one answer. So the petition that folks signed to get on the ballot had all props kind of as one, and then instead of individual petitions. So some signers were saying they were kind of misled by that, were they? And kind of a second part to that with the ballot petition is some of the 15 folks in the committee don't favor all the propositions. So can you kind of respond to that double question there?
Yes, absolutely. No, petitioners or signers were not misled. We've had opponents to our campaign say that, but that's politics in our view. The petition had all of the reforms on the front page. It had all of the amendments in the petition. Our petitioners, which were a professional, union organized canvassing operation, had a wonderful process of explaining each petition item while they were asking for signatures. So it was extremely clear, and on every page of the petition, exactly what folks were signing. On the second part of the question, again, I think this is a little bit of confusion, and I appreciate the opportunity to clear it up. Our campaign, before we started the campaign part, really focused on the policymaking part, wanted to make sure that we had proposals that were well structured, that were well considered, that were debated. And to do that, we asked 15 people to join this group, not to endorse the proposals. That was never a condition of joining. And in fact, we deliberately sought out ideological differences on the commission. We had representatives from labor, a union president. We had representatives from business and the Chamber of Commerce. We had representatives from neighborhoods and anti-gentrification activists, and we had representatives from folks who favor more density. We had representation from all sorts of different corners of the Austin political and civic community, and geographic representation as well. So we wanted to encourage that kind of debate, to make sure that as many voices as possible were in the room to sharpen these proposals. And so I'm not, and then later we shifted to campaigns, and most of the group, in fact, more than 2/3 came on board and joined our campaign once that got started. But we did not expect everybody to support each reform. And that was never the ask that we made of them. Even the city-run charter commission doesn't have unanimous votes. For example, that public financing provision that we brought back had 3 no votes on that commission, and yet it was advanced. So that was never our expectation. And we think that the reforms would have suffered had we insisted upon a kind of homogeneity of thought on the group. We wanted to make sure that there was that kind of ideological diversity to get the right policies out of that process.
Kind of following up on that, another question posted in the chat: who ultimately decided on the final versions of the propositions if it wasn't the 15-member group?
It was the members of the 15 members of the group that decided on these propositions and
Okay.
all the different elements within them.
There is a question. I'm not sure I fully understand the question, so we may ask for some clarification on this later on. So it's okay if you also don't know the answer, Andrew. This sets up the elimination of homeowner rights pursuant to Senate Bill 1120 and Senate Bill 29. I'm not familiar with those, but maybe you are. Is this just another form of gerrymandering? The mayor only votes now to break ties.
I'm not certain about the particular bills that are referenced, and perhaps, Bruce, we can chat about this. I'd love to learn more about what you're referring to. The mayor votes now in all votes. The mayor does not only vote now to break ties. The mayor is a voting member like the other members of the council.
Great. And then one last question here. How much was spent gathering signatures for the petition, and did that come from the PAC? Was that money kind of coming from the PAC?
Yes, thank you. $145,000 went to the union organized canvassing firm that collected the signatures for the petition. Another $45,000 to $50,000 were spent on community engagement. So of the amount of money that our campaign has spent overall, a substantial percentage, much more than half, that we've spent all time, going back to our founding in July, was spent on the petition and on community engagement to make sure that the process went well. More than $200,000 total on those two things.
Great. We'll give like another 30 seconds for any last questions we may have. Also, major kudos to our audience. I definitely thought we were going to have some folks slipping in some strong mayor questions because Andrew was here, but I know many of you were probably on the talk last week. Okay, here's a follow-up question to that last. Where did the money come from?
Great. All of our contributions are reported, and we have a report that came out on January 15th, as well as one that'll be coming out this week. We are, as a PAC, we report all contributions of any amount. And I know there are some organizations that don't do that, but we do. And so that's all been reported. I'm a large donor to the campaign. There are others who are as well. Our median contribution is $100 on the campaign. We have more than 200 donors, I believe, right now who have pitched in for the campaign thus far.
All right, Andrew. Well, thank you very much for joining us the second week in a row. We greatly appreciate it. And for those of you on the call that missed last week, definitely go back and listen to the recording. There is a lot of great back and forth there. So, Andrew, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, well, there's a few more things we're going to cover. Just one more slide, kind of going over early voting, voting in the voter's guide. And then after that, I would like to give a heads up to Joanne Richards if she would like to talk about anything Common Ground for Texans is doing in the next month after this next slide. And if any folks, now again, you know, we are not saying yay or nay to any of the propositions, but if you have any technical questions about what something in a proposition might mean, we do have some time here at the end to answer those. So before we turn it over to Joanne, there are some important dates. Early voting, April 19th through the 27th, and the general election is on a Saturday on May 1st. The voter's guide is coming out soon from the League of Women Voters Austin area, where we do have simplified explainers for all of these propositions written in numerous languages. And if you have a group, you can find it through our website or through the website for Common Ground. I think that's talking about the recording, but you can also find the voter's guide on our website, and it will be available in time for early voting. And you may want to look through it, but also we really encourage you to spread out that virtual version of it, so to any groups that may be interested as well. Joanne, would you like to talk about any events coming up for Common Ground for Texans in the next month?
Sure, I'd love to. So April 17th, which is a Saturday from 2 to 4, we will have a program on media action, how to consume the news. And we have someone from Braver Angels who is putting together some, I guess I would say, a guide for how to consume the news. And we will also have someone from the University of Texas, Moody School of Communication, who will also give us a more academic look at what's happening and how we should approach the news, which I hope everybody will enjoy.
That sounds very interesting. There also is one event I would like to kind of showcase that some of my colleagues at the League of Women Voters Austin area are putting on, and that's our Civics 201 session. We have done Civics 101, and now we are in Civics 201, which is basically how to interact with different levels of government. So the Civics 201 session 4 is going to be understanding government, engaging with city council, how to do that, how to testify, things like that. I know a lot of folks on here are pretty familiar with that process, but if you're not, it's not always the easiest to understand. And so that session is going to be on April 14th at 5:30, and you can find it on our league calendar. I think it's especially fitting to talk about that program that's done by Jen Delk at the League of Women Voters Austin area, because a lot of the stuff that was coming up in the chat, especially during Prop B, was stuff that's not necessarily on the ballot, but would be really good things for the council to hear and really good ideas. We do have one question here. Short turnaround time in the pandemic. Can mail-in ballot voters be grandfathered for this municipal election? I saw that we have some of our voting experts on here. So if anyone else, I don't know the answer to that question, but if any of my colleagues here would like to pop that in, if you happen to know the answer to that, we can have that as well. And here we also have the video from last week on YouTube, and it's available on both our website and the Common Ground for Texans website, and this recording will be available on both of those as well. Well, you need to apply afresh for a mail-in ballot. It only applies to a calendar year. So that was kind of the answer to the mail-in ballot there. All right, well, we did finish a little early, so I probably could have maybe let everyone talk longer, but I feel like we got a really good broad idea on everything. So we're going to go ahead and close it down, but before we do that, I want to thank everybody for attending. Also, if you have any feedback or there's any kind of events that you would like to see like this in the future, I'm going to pop my email in the chat. And we would love to hear any feedback on this event. Maybe you wish we had moderated a slightly different way, or potentially you have ideas for a future program you would like to see the League of Women Voters and maybe Common Ground for Texans co-sponsor as well. We would love to hear about that. So you will see my email there in the chat. A couple more things going on in the chat. The website for Common Ground for Texans is in there. We're translating the voter's guide into Spanish, Chinese, and Vietnamese, which is really exciting. And this is only, I believe, the second election we have done Chinese and Vietnamese. So it's a really good thing to be able to do. And one other thing listed here, the pro-con speakers on Prop B, we're talking at cross purposes. You know, there's always a lot of different theories on how to moderate these kind of things. Certainly, if you watched last week, you can kind of see the full expert in Joanne, who's probably a bit better at moderating than I am, but thank you for hanging with me there. I know that maybe shorter time limits sometimes can make people kind of focus on the issue. So that's something we can look at next time. All right, well, I think that's everything. Thank you. I hope you all have a good rest of your weekend, and we will see you virtually, hopefully at one of these upcoming events, and maybe before too long in person, hopefully.
And thank you very much for hosting. It was
you.
wonderful. Thank you so very much.
All right, thank you, everybody. Have a good weekend.